It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the decline of reading in American life and what it might mean. The cover story of the August edition of The Atlantic makes the case that America has entered what the writer calls a post-literate age. A post-literate age. It's from staff writer Rose Horowitch. A librarian in Texas told Horowitch about a 3-year-old who cried on her first day of school for her tablet. A professor at Harvard told her about a student who used ChatGPT to translate A Clockwork Orange into simpler English because the original novel was tough to get through. Horowitch has been collecting stories like these, and she thinks they're evidence of a real shift in how Americans relate to reading and therefore to the world. Her piece in The Atlantic is titled, "The End of Reading is Here." Rose, thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming on the show about it. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And listeners, you can help us report this story. Do you yourself read less than you used to? Are you a teacher, librarian, student, or parent seeing the shift up close among others? What do you want to say? What do you want to ask? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. For the majority of the listeners who have not read your article, you begin and end it with the Library of Alexandria. Why was that the right place to bookend a piece about reading habits in 2026 America?
Yes, I started a very long time ago with the Library of Alexandria, and I started with the story of the Library of Alexandria because for a long time, historians thought that the library, disappeared because of an act of war or violence. People thought that Julius Caesar burned it. But lately, the kind of scholarly consensus has been that actually the library just was neglected until it eventually disappeared. And so it wasn't that, this very dramatic action, led to the start of the Dark Ages. It was actually that, the fact that the library was allowed to be destroyed, that nobody cared about maintaining it, meant that the Dark Ages were already there. And I wanted to kind of draw a parallel with, today, what we see, the decline of reading, kind of the decline of the importance of reading, that maybe we're going through something similar.
Let's define the decline of reading. You have some data, I think, on how much less the average American is reading compared to the past. But you also write that paradoxically, and I know people will call in text with this, and, they won't be wrong, Americans are probably reading more words than ever before because of all the social media and texting and everything else. So what's the data that you're working from to, write an end of literacy article?
Yes, exactly. So the data shows that, the share of Americans who read a book or an article on any given day has declined by 40% over the past 2 decades. In 2022, which is the most recent year that we have really strong data for, fewer than half of all Americans read a book at all, and only 38% read a novel or short story. And so, the data is kind of very clear, all going in this direction. But you're right to point out that, I note in the piece that, people often talk about this as a literacy crisis, and I don't think that's right. People are actually probably reading more than ever. We read so many emails, so many text messages, so many social media posts. But what I think is happening is that is actually crowding out kind of the time necessary to read, to really get engaged in a serious work of literature. And it's making it hard to focus on anything for an extended period of time. So we're almost reading so many words that, we can't really pay attention to any of them.
And so to the place of schools in all of this, you write, faced with shrinking attention spans and declining comprehension, schools might have been expected to resist the impulse toward shorter passages and shallower reading, your words. And yet, what actually happened?
Yes, so we have a lot of data that, teachers are assigning fewer and fewer books. A survey from last year found that, most teachers assigned between 0 and 4 books a year, which is a decline from the past. And so, we're seeing kind of an emphasis on excerpts, on reading comprehension questions to prepare students for standardized testing. And so that's kind of, one end of the coin. One side of the coin is that, books have really left the classroom. And then on the other side, we're seeing that, schools are really bringing in tablets and Chromebooks and iPads. A survey found that 80% of elementary school teachers said that students received a school-issued device by kindergarten. So, we're seeing a lot fewer books in schools, and then, that's been replaced with, digital devices.
So on why this matters, I'm going to read another quote from your article. And listeners, this is the one to really pay attention to if you haven't been paying attention yet. Rose wrote in The Atlantic, "The decline of reading will bring about changes of the same magnitude as the advent of reading and writing. It will affect our innermost thoughts, our society's politics and culture, and how we tell the history of our civilization. If we look closely, we can see that these changes have already begun." Wow. How do you know?
So, as part of this piece, I really looked at the history of the rise of reading. It seems like people have been reading forever, but actually reading is kind of unnatural for humans, and it only emerged 6,000 years ago, which is actually relatively recent, in the course of human history. And, what we see in this great book by Walter Ong, who wrote Orality and Literacy, is that the advent of reading and writing completely transformed society. Writing separates the writer from what they've written, so it allows for the more dispassionate spread of information. You have to slow down to write something. We write a lot slower than we speak, and also you can see it reflected back at you on the page and then go back to it and kind of gain new understanding. And Ong argues that this ushered in a new form of rational and analytical thought, and that it really was allowed for, philosophy and modern science and all of these things that we kind of take for granted now, actually really depended on reading and writing. And so, I was looking, if we see that happened, when writing first came into being, what happens now as we're reading and writing so much less and sort of replacing that with video?
Some interesting pushback texts coming in. Listener writes, "Former New Yorker, mom, lawyer, recovering classical musician in North Jersey here. Longtime listener, my kids are obsessed with books and reading. We go to our local library at least weekly." That's one. Here's another one. "Barnes & Noble has flourished recently. My daughter-in-law just asked me for a book for her birthday. I don't see a decline in reading." So I can tell you just from the standpoint of this show, for what it's worth, small unrepresentative sample, we're getting pitched by publishers every day for the spate of new books that they're always releasing.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point. I write in my piece, print book sales were higher last year than they were a decade ago. You see all these celebrity book clubs, Substack is flourishing, Barnes & Noble is opening new stores, and so there are all these kind of optimistic, anecdotes that people are reading more. At the same time, what the data shows is that it's the small group of readers that are reading more. So the pool of people who read books is continually shrinking. Last year, 20% of Americans read 80% of all the books that were read. And so what we see is kind of as fewer and fewer people read, the people who still do kind of lean into that identity more. They actually seem to spend more time reading than they used to, but they're just becoming more and more of a minority in society.
Is it necessarily bad? I could imagine an argument that says, look, society has always revolved around whatever the communication technology of the time is. So there were people who worried about a negative effect that reading would have when the printing press was first invented. Oh, people are going to sit around and get lost in their books, and they're not going to interact with each other so much anymore, and we're going to have this isolated society and people not acting in community. You've probably heard that historical critique. And then if you go to the 20th century, why did people start going to movies and movie theaters? Because there wasn't the technology to have anything like that in your home. And why did they start listening to the radio? Because that was the first time that live streaming, if we want to use that word, audio was available to people in their homes. Then eventually came television and what that changed. And now all these things coexist, but they're all sort of competing with each other for people's attention. But society didn't disintegrate because of the book. Society didn't disintegrate because of radio. Society moved on. I mean, certainly, Hitler used radio very effectively, right? But so did FDR. And society adapts to the technology that's there, and it's always complicated. What would you say to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I tried to, in the piece, in the process of writing it, I, came across a lot of, these examples that you're citing. The Atlantic had published a piece 126 years ago that was really worried about what the daily newspaper was going to do to people's brains. And, reading the news was going to stop people from reading books. And so, it really is a perennial complaint that, new technologies will destroy everything. I think one thing that's illustrative here is Plato's story, the Phaedrus, where there's this kind of famous example of Socrates worrying that writing will ruin people's memories because they'll never have to exercise their memory and they'll just write everything down. And I think if you look at that, in one sense he was right. We don't practice using our memories anymore, as much anymore, and so it would be very hard to memorize the Iliad or the Odyssey today. And yet, I think a lot of people would say that trade-off is worth it. So I tried to be open to the possibility that there's, something that we don't yet know that will, come from this that makes video better than reading. But at the same time, I think I lay out in the piece that, there are a lot of ways that reading has just structured the society that we live in, that we, need to be cognizant of, that is changing.
So does society become, since we talk a lot about politics on this show, radicalized? Does it become more politically uninformed? What happens culturally with the decline of reading that you're describing?
Mm-hmm. So from sort of reading, sifting through studies and talking to experts, it seems that the effects on politics are that, video kind of privileges a politician who is really charismatic, kind of appears authentic and of the people, is able to present things as, very simplistic. Every policy problem has a very simple solution, and is able to kind of make people feel things, grab their attention, and make them want to watch a video. And, in a sense that is now a very good way to campaign, is just to, be a very charismatic person because everyone's going to see the way that you're, kind of acting and speaking all the time. The challenge arises when, if everything has to be communicated in a 15-second soundbite, what has to be glossed over in order to do that? And, a lot of things just aren't that simple. So I think that, that's sort of what we see politically.
Here's a text from a listener. I'm a middle school teacher in East New York, Brooklyn, and I noticed that now that kids can't have their phones in school, they have started to get back into reading, but it's still very difficult to get them to complete reading homework when they presumably have access to devices, etc., at home. So that's one interesting one. Here's another teacher calling in. Rebecca in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Brian. I want to speak not to leisure reading, but rather to what the person who just texted spoke to. I teach high school at an independent school, and I want to speak to the connection between reading and writing and analytical thinking. And one thing that is militating against our ability to get students to read longer form scholarly pieces is that a lot of databases that our kids use for research projects, for instance, I'm thinking of something called JSTOR, now offer AI assistance where it will distill the entire article and tell you what it's speaking to, what other scholars it's discussing, and then suddenly kids don't have to read a 30-page piece. Or they're trying to read a book, but because so much is open source and online, they can just type in, summarize this book for me. So when students, because their attention spans are shorter or because they're distracted by shiny things, Instagram or TikTok, they are not sitting down to read. And I think they're also very much losing the ability to read. And if they can't read in longer form pieces, they can't analyze or think critically for themselves, which means they can't write in an analytical or critical way. So these things are so closely connected. And my colleagues and I are definitely seeing that kids can't hold their attention, and they also can't process, and they can't digest. So we're trying to go back to analog things and now say, okay, we're not using an online textbook anymore because we know what you guys can do with it. You're going to have to buy the hard version, and we are going to do reading checks every day, and we're going to teach you how to annotate in the margins to try to push against this. But I will say that as teachers, it's like the whole world and all these tech companies are trying actively to undermine what we're doing. And I will say that we're seeing kids' intellectual abilities are weakening year by year. And as a parent as well, this is so depressing.
Yeah. Rose Horowitch, I want to put you on the spot and see if, as the writer of The Atlantic, of this piece on The Atlantic, you want to engage with this teacher, Rebecca from Manhattan, because I'm listening to her and I'm thinking, wow, this is just the kind of person who Rose might have quoted in the article if you had spoken to her, or who might pique your interest.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. It's so great to hear from you and hear your experience. And that was something that I was hearing from other teachers that I spoke with as well. We know that scores on the ACT, reading and sections have declined for the past 7 years, and they are now at their lowest level in 30 years. And, I was just hearing over and over from teachers that they've always kind of had to focus on teaching students about the content of, what they're reading, but that now they actually have to teach them how they expect them to read and kind of how to recognize what is a metaphor, how to, persist through more challenging or works of text. And so there's that real shift that they have to teach them, like how they expect them now to read books.
Rebecca, anything you want to say as a follow-up before you go?
Yeah, thank you. I would say as a history teacher rather than an English teacher, what's less important to me than identifying a metaphor is actually asking kids, do you see the connection between what we just spoke about and the idea that you read about what was occurring in the 1640s? Do you know what I mean? It's actually asking them to connect ideas, and because they're not reading as deeply as they used to, they're not making those connections. So it's really the deeper underlying analytical and critical thinking muscle that I think is atrophying.
Thank you for your call, Rebecca. We really appreciate it, and good luck doing that. I guess grunt work, should we call it that? Educational grunt work? The grind of, and it's really interesting, Rose, right? As an antidote to this, day by day, reinforcing with the kids, you have to have done this particular block of reading when you come in the next day, and you're going to be held accountable for it. I don't know how easy it is to use that as a model and get teachers all over the country to do that every single day.
Yes, so for that, I didn't report as much on that for this piece, but it's something that I've definitely reported on in the past, and it is just, very hard. I mean, as we were hearing from the other person who texted in, it's really hard to make sure that kids are reading outside of school and doing their homework, when there's a lot of temptations and distractions.
And interestingly, we're getting so many texts that note that kids are not being assigned full books in school, including at what might be called popular or elite New York City schools that people are mentioning and calling them by that name, those names. This is, and there was another article that I read in another magazine just the other day about the elite universities in general. I mean, Ivies and universities like that not assigning full books to their students in the way they used to. You concur with that?
Yes. So in 2024, I wrote a piece that was called "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." And it was, about this topic exactly. It was, professors finding that their students were arriving at college and their middle and high schools had never asked them to read a full book or had only asked them to read a few full books. And so they were just utterly unprepared for the reading load. So I think that is a really interesting kind of contributor to this that sometimes gets overlooked, with the focus on technology and cell phones, that, what's happening in schools is also a big driver.
Yeah, and that article was interesting because it was in the Conservative National Review, and the conservative writer's angle was, oh, you think liberal bias is a problem at elite universities? Look at this. They're not even being given full books or long articles to read as opposed to excerpts and chapters and stuff. Cordelia in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello, Cordelia.
Hi, Brian. Nice to speak to you. I'm a student from New York. I recently graduated high school.
Congratulations.
And I just wanted to talk, thank you, about my experience in the classroom. I've found that we do not read very much. In the past 2 years, in each year, we've read one book in English class and none in any other class. And I just find that the culture of reading has really changed. And I believe that it is on part because of the technology access that students have had, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, a lot of my teachers have confessed to me that they don't read either. Even my English teacher. And I really think that we cannot be teaching only nonfiction like a lot of schools have started doing. And instead, the fiction writing helps students understand and interpret big ideas and kind of what your caller was talking about with critical thinking skills. And I've tried to push to read in my own life, but I know that a lot of my friends and fellow classmates have not. And yeah.
Yeah. Cordelia Rose, anything you want to ask Cordelia as a recent high school grad?
I guess I'm curious, and I know you've been progressing through the years, but, how things have kind of changed over time, from even when you started in 9th grade to now 12th or graduating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the quantity of books has surely decreased. There's also definitely more of an emphasis on using computers in class. And what you said earlier about using multiple choice questions and studying for things like the Regents exams in New York has become far more popular than especially reading fiction stories that require more like critical thought and abstract thought. And the book choices also have been shorter books with a lot more concrete language. And I know that my fellow classmates and occasionally I struggle to comprehend it despite our efforts. And I think that comes not only from the students, but also just from the culture in schools.
Cordelia, thanks. Call us again. And congratulations again on graduating. That term concrete language, that's a thing, right?
Yes. Well, one thing that we know that really struck me as I was listening to Cordelia is that the more you read, the easier it is to comprehend because you just have so much more background knowledge. So it is really a compounding problem if we're not, if we're not exposing people to as many ideas or as much information, it becomes, or as much vocabulary, it becomes then much harder to confront each new book.
I have a friend who wrote a novel recently and got it published and told me that some of the reviews on social media sites were that the book was too literary and there wasn't enough action. And so there's that, what I think the caller was calling concrete, as opposed to sort of literary or abstract thinking that's being conveyed in reading. Before we run out of time, obviously the overwhelming majority of our listeners are convinced that this is a real problem and really threatens society in various ways. If, given the politics of our area generally, this line from your article will put the rest of them over the top. Trump's communication style is perfectly suited to an oral society. So if you want to talk about that, if it's not obvious, you can do that for a minute and then connect it also in a political context to inequality, because I would imagine some people lose out more than others in a post-literate age. So give us some thoughts on those two things, and then we're out of time.
Okay. Yes. So in the piece, I say that Trump is our first post-literate president. And what I mean by that is that it's very difficult to imagine him being elected, in a country where information is primarily spread through text. But he's, so good at kind of communicating in this age through videos and social media posts. He kind of uses epithets that honestly call back to Homer of saying, Sleepy Joe, and it's just easy to remember and repeat. He really appeals to, his listeners' emotions. And so, all of these things we kind of see that he has been able to kind of exploit the changes of the post-literate age, and other politicians are starting to try to recognize and mimic this. And to what you were saying about inequality, we definitely do find that though declines are happening, for everyone in the amount that they're reading, it's clearly separated as well by, socioeconomic status. And so, that is a real threat if, some people continue reading and then some people don't have that access or aren't asked to do it in school. That is a big challenge we face.
The article is called "The End of Reading is Here." And Rosa, I want to say that as I was reading the article yesterday and just kind of looking at your article block, if we had another half hour, I would start pushing you down the road of how 3 different universities issued reports on why higher education and elite institutions generally are losing public support. But maybe we can do that another time. For today, The End of Reading is Here. Rose Horowitch, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so, on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.